Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Kristen Balasia, Vice President of Consulting at S&P Global Mobility. Today, we'll be discussing what's on everyone's mind, what is going on with the transition to EVs in the US market, and what can we expect next. Yes, absolutely a lot going on with this story globally, but today we're largely going to be focused on the US market and the many and fast-moving factors that are influencing the speed and nature of this industry and transition. I'm pleased to be joined today by Guido Vildozo, Associate Director at S&P Global Mobility. Hello, Guido.
Hi there, Kristen. Delighted to join you today. As we all know, the fluidity of electrification is keeping many up at night. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely. And really, I think it's such a wide ranging topic affecting really everyone in the industry. I mean, whether you're an OEM, a supplier, a battery manufacturer, someone in the investment community, it's such a high stakes, game of poker, and people have put a lot of chips out there on the table. So as we get started, and I can't tell you, Guido, because you hear it more than I do, the number of questions that we get from every angle, almost every day, about something that's come up relating to this EV transition. I won't say stops and starts, but maybe the slowdowns and the speeding up in the US market, everything from the not so distant EPA announcements to interest rate and pricing impact to constantly changing OEM strategies, consumer adoption, and the upcoming elections. It feels like everything is changing again. And we thought we had a lot of change before, when really looking back, it kind of feels like those factors were more stable than they are today, which is hard to imagine. So if we start from the beginning here and just start with an overall state of the industry, Guido, of where we're at, some of those key drivers, and we know they can change on a daily, monthly basis, but where are we at today and what is it looking like?
Great question, Kristen. And let's take a step backwards and start to think about the path that we have walked over the last few years, especially since COVID, and the reality that we are at today. From that particular standpoint, as we look at how we closed the first quarter, we're still doing very well. It's reflecting positive upwards momentum. We're still above that 15 million unit SAAR, which is great because it means that we're keeping our plants humming. We are starting to see that inventories have crept up. We're sitting north of 2.5 million units, where we probably thought that was going to come in later, further down the road. So that's certainly, obviously, there's good news and bad news. And some of that, of course, is reflected on how incentives are playing out, but that's not necessarily a completely bad story. Well, that may be a bad story for OEMs, where incentives are up somewhere between 50 to 100% over the last year. The fact that we can roll those out are definitely attractive to consumers. And at the end of the day, we're going back to basics here, where let's understand what's on the consumer's mind and tie that together to where the automotive industry needs to go. And, are we back to business as usual, or are we still in this new world that we had envisioned coming out of COVID? From that particular standpoint, the consumer is still very much cautious to inflation and interest rates. Pricing seems to be the top concern. And no surprise right here, we've seen this overall in the average amount financed on loans and the length maturity on loans, because obviously we're at a world of being close to $1,000 a month when it comes to payments. So if we grab that, and we know that, yes, the consumer is definitely happy to kick tires, as long as those tires are cheap, the financing is attractive. How can we start to bundle that back together to where you started off at? And it's essentially, let's start to look at the reality that the automotive industry is dealing with right now, because when we came out of COVID, we thought we were going to essentially build to order. We were moving towards higher segments. And that, of course, was going to allow us to be able to electrify at a much faster pace than, the reality that may be coming in a not so distant future. So it's that mix of, let's talk about that aspiration. And we had a few curveballs along the way, which you've already alluded to. And part of that really coming in the shape of the cost structure behind labor. In some of the revisions that we had in the US and Canada, that are very quickly likely going to impact profitability. And then, of course, that's the balancing act that the OEMs have to pursue. How do I keep that consumer happy from a pricing standpoint, and understanding very well that inflation and interest rates are top of mind relative to what I initially thought I was going to do, which was a world of built to order, highly electrified, super profitable. But now I've got to make sure that I offset this 25% increase in labor costs coming in through 2028. So definitely a moment where keeping this balancing act is certainly going to be a challenge for many.
Yeah, and people, I think, don't talk about that so much, but those, behind the curtain realities of what's driving pricing and more so profitability, impacts these OEM decisions and adoption. So like you said, the consumer certainly is looking at a lot of competitive product out there. They're starting to get used to incentives again. But the world's changed, and pretty significantly for some OEMs, right?
Absolutely. And that's where, as you mentioned, the 2019 world did not have the influence of BEVs in massive shape. There was only one car company back in the day that was carrying volumes of electrified vehicles in showrooms at that point in time, and that was Tesla. So we were talking about a game of one, whereas today, this is a flux that we're seeing towards a showroom that not only has to have more models, but it also has to have more propulsion systems, and I won't say powertrains because some of those may go away, but more propulsion systems readily available, because that is what Uncle Sam wants from you. Uncle Sam behind the scenes is calling out and saying, hey, you, I want you. And I want you at 50% ZEV by 2030.
Yeah. And so, Uncle Sam, so maybe going a bit to regulation, there was a lot of noise around the EPA announcement a few weeks ago now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, because this is the balancing act that OEMs have to do at this point of time. And it's really looking at, Uncle Sam says 50% ZEV. And that was really the underlying direction as a result of where the EPA final mandate was at. And it's really a combination of elements, because many think that, okay, the EPA laid it out. There's 3 different paths, and one path, if I'm going through only 2 propulsion systems, ICE and BEV, says 40 or 41%. Mm-hmm. But if I have to create a mix and I can throw in some plug-in hybrids, or I can throw in some hybrids, then I only need to be at 30%. The catch right there, though, is there are 2 more elements that Uncle Sam is demanding from the industry, and those are coming in the shape of a recalibrated EMPG. And what does that mean? In the past, historically, if we had a BEV in the showroom, the rating of miles per gallon was so high because, of course, it doesn't have any CO2 emissions. And therefore, if on average we got a 350 miles per gallon rating on that vehicle, that calibration of EMPG is one of the first points that the government wanted to address to be able to cut back on the proliferation of ICE. And it was coming in and saying, yeah, you're going to be forced to sell a lot more BEVs because I won't allow you to take as much credit from these vehicles. So when looking at Uncle Sam, there's obviously the first piece that we see in the news and had front pages on essentially every single news outlet in the US, from sea to shining sea. But then we got to look at EMPG that got very little coverage. And then there's one more element, which is what happens to other pollutants, because, of course, it's not only a CO2 situation. They are trying to pursue, or this administration is trying to pursue, a fast adoption of electric vehicles. And therefore, those are the 3 different channels that they have to do this. Now, needless to say, we can't completely bash the industry or say, that's where the stick is at. This is also an administration that has done a lot to try to support the industry, fully understanding this trifecta of elements of pricing, propulsion systems, and regulation, and realizing that there's a gap between the 2. And there comes IRA. And IRA comes in the shape of a consumer credit and a manufacturer credit, which allows for that gap between where BEV pricing is at and internal combustion engine pricing is at to narrow down. Not completely close, but narrow down. And it's also allowing for at least those plug-in hybrids built in North America today to also see that gap close down. So there's definitely a means or a carrot, if you so wish to call it,
Mhm.
to make that affordability transition a little bit more tangible as long as you meet the requirements.
Yeah, and I think that that was a really nice summary, and it looks like you said, there's still paths to get there. You can see how the OEMs are responding, and you can see to a certain extent how consumers are responding. So we often hear, like you said, the headlines, right? So people see the headlines of, oh, EV adoption is slowing. So we're still seeing growth and we're still seeing multi-speed market, even as OEMs come out with more, hybrids and plugins and different paths to achieve the end goal, which really has just been shifted and moderated a bit. But it's not all bad news, right? So if you look at, our US EV registration data, for example, if you look at last month, year over year, actually, we look at February 24 compared to 23. One of the kind of headlines was, EV US registration volumes down 4.6%. But if you pull back the curtains and you really look deeper, I mean, everyone likes to talk about Tesla a lot, but the volume in this country is largely Tesla EV volume. So if you look at Tesla alone, Tesla was down year over year, 24.6%. All the other brands, less Tesla, if you pull Tesla out, they were actually up 34%. So these great products that people are putting out, that people are excited to buy, that, depending on whether you look at maybe BMW or Audi that were up well over 100%, they have some great products out there, right? Or some people are finding them to be exciting. You look at brands like Kia putting out some good looking product at more attractive price points, they were up over 100%, right? So there's still growth and momentum in pockets. And, so it's just clear that it's not a one size fits all story. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, as we often talk about this transition at an industry level, but it's really at a brand level, a model and segment level, at a price point level. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And when we were thinking about the BEV, we were very closely looking at what Tesla was doing. And what the market is telling us right now, when the news coverage focuses on, hey, be careful, BEV sales are sputtering. Are they really? And that brings us over to the short term, because this storyline is very much in flux. It's very fluid, and it will probably have a storyline of short term, medium term, and long term. But focusing again on the short term, the takeaway here, and you've already alluded to this, is what is going to drive 2024? What can I anticipate from 2025? If we know that we closed somewhere between 7 and 8% last year, we're moving sideways so far this year. And we can't deny the fact that we have roughly about 40 models coming into showroom before the end of the year. And there's a similar number coming in 2025. And that inertia will continue to lift up sales for BEVs, because if you build them, they will come. And then that balancing act of saying, okay, we've got these models, they're gaining momentum, but it's also understanding how much are they going to take away from the leader, where up to this point, it's been a Tesla story, and we're about to transition into multiple different stories. One that is going to be for the volume brands, the Chevys, the Toyotas of the world, some that is going to be related to the premium brands, the BMWs and Mercedes of the world, and what their electrification trajectory is going to look like. And then, of course, the new players, the disruptors, because it's not only a Tesla story when we're looking at new players. We've got Rivian and we've got Lucid and a few more that are going to join us in a not so distant future. So being able to master that capacity of what that showroom looks like for each one of these different clusters is going to be absolutely critical for the industry to follow, as well as suppliers to remain on top of.
Yeah, great point. Because we do talk about OEMs a lot, but when you're a supplier, whether, you're a battery supplier or any other component, they're getting asked questions every day, especially when their boards or, other investment concerns or executives see, oh, what's going on with EVs? Well, hold on, we might be in a better spot than we thought, might not be. But really, I think those details are important. All right, so we got through, some of the easy conversation, Guido, about all of the things going on and having an impact here. So maybe a more, provocative question for you. In your view, you talk about this a lot, and you research this a lot. Of everything that we've talked about and people think of about the influences to EV adoption, What do you think really has the biggest influence to adoption of the probably dozen factors that we could name?
Phenomenal question, Kristen. And if I were in the shoes of some of these executives, and the challenge that I'm getting from corporates is 100% electrified by 2035, the next question that I start to think about is how do I make these available to all consumers? What is pricing going to look like for the consumer? Because if we start to look at the Tesla story, and again, just only looking at the one that has received the most attention, when they launched Model S and Model X, those two vehicles, from a pricing standpoint, and thinking about the fact that they were priced north of 60,000, those were only able to address roughly about 5% of the market. Looking at Model Y and Model 3 before dynamic pricing came into place, they were only able to address roughly about 40% of the market. And it's not only until now where we're pushing into that territory of roughly somewhere between 30 to 40,000 that we're moving into that direction of saying, okay, now I can address 70% of the market. So it's that capacity to be able to bring in cheaper vehicles or more affordable vehicles, battery electric vehicles, that push towards what mass consumption is like. And is that price point 25,000? Is that price point 30,000? And of course, that's certainly, as mentioned earlier, if I were in their shoes, that's what would be keeping me up at night.
Yep, fair, great point. So with everything changing so quickly, I mean, I feel like almost every day there's something that we thought we knew that changed. How do these guys across the industry that are also, by the way, trying to run their business, just kind of, there is no BAU, there's no business as usual anymore, I don't think, but they are running pretty complicated, complex global businesses amongst, keeping their eye on everything that's changing. So how do they stay abreast, not only of everything that's changing, all the movement and volatility, but really understanding quickly and easily what impacts their business and how to respond to it?
Great question. And this is where creativity comes into place, because if we look back at where our conversation over the last 15 minutes or so, what are we talking about? We're talking about regulation. We're talking about Uncle Sam. We're talking about pricing. We're talking about the consumer coming into place. And then, of course, this is where we have to be creative and be able to come up with a storyline of how do I navigate this unknown road, because yes, we saw the North Star, but there was no road leading up to the North Star, where we're building that road right now. How do we navigate this road, and how can I be creative in using additional resources, whether it's hybrids, plug-in hybrids, whatever it may be, to be able to satisfy all of these requirements? And that's where being able to tackle this combination of regulation, pricing, and powertrain mix is what's going to keep us entertained over the next few years.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. So, final question. In your view, are we at a point where we know all of the things that we don't know, or do you see additional uncertainty lurking around the next corner?
Absolutely. I like to split this out into three different buckets. There's the known knowns. What are those? Regulation. Uncle Sam has very clearly told us what they expect from us. There's the unknown knowns. We know that we have to go towards $25,000. Are we going to be able to do it? Yes or no? We don't know. And there, of course, lies the third question, which is the unknown in regards to what do we not know and what are we not seeing, what is in the blind spot, and we don't have a lane detection system on the vehicle that we're driving. So if that's the case, should we be worried about a Chinese OEM, major disruption to the supply chain, and being able to stay abreast of all of these different topics is critical. And it's not as simple as saying, yeah, these are the overarching themes for the industry. These are the overarching themes that if I were a supplier, I would have to follow for each one of my clients, because there's going to be a roadmap for each and all of them. That is certainly going to be a requirement of how to address survivability further down the road.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for those insights. A lot to think about and keep on top of, and you do a great job of that. So thanks for the time this morning, Guido.
Thank you, Kristen. Truly appreciate the time and very much looking forward to a future engagement.
Absolutely. So with that, we will end it here and just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month. To opt into our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, please visit spglobal.com/mobility.